Hello, welcome to my visual presentation for my signature assignment. I'm going to treat this as sort of like a vlog, not exactly off the cuff, a little bit more prepared than a vlog might normally be, but this is going to be my video blog for my presentation. And I made a presentation in Google Slides just to sort of like make things a little bit more visual and make things a little bit easier to understand. I called my presentation, my project, the squeaky wheel, and we'll sort of get into why by the end of my presentation. But basically, the squeaky wheel is it's a comparison of three different education systems, problems of equity, cultural diversity, problems of practice across the US, Brazil, and Ireland. And so rather than talking about it, let's just go ahead and get right into it, right? So first, I think before we get into the problems of practice and sort of like the issues surrounding equity, um, in these three nations, let's talk about their education systems, right? United States, this is the one that everyone in the United States is familiar with, right? Elementary, middle, and high school. Elementary running from kinder to fifth or sixth, depending on district or state. And students are usually 5 to 12 years old in that run, right? I think US starts the earliest out of any of these in terms of mandatory, and we're even going to make universal TK in California mandatory here. It's slowly becoming more universal. Middle and high school are also mandatory, running anywhere from 7th grade to 12th grade, with ages being 12 to 18 years old. In Ireland, they split it into primary and post-primary. Primary runs from 1st to 5th, and that's mandatory starting at 6 years old until they're about 11. And then they have post-primary, which is split into a junior cycle and a senior cycle. In the junior cycle, which is 6th to 9th grade, they add a little bit more to the curriculum, right? Interestingly, primary requires students learn Irish, like Gaelic. So post-primary, they add the junior cycle, which adds a little bit more to the workload. And then the senior cycle, which I believe is optional. And the senior cycle, which runs from 10th to 12th grade, there's three different sort of tracks and three different final exams, depending on the track you're on in that senior cycle. And 12th grade is typically optional unless people want to use it as a transition year. So anyway, runs anywhere from, when they're 12 to when they're 17, 18 in for post-primary. In Brazil, it's split into Ensino Fundamental and Ensino Medio. Ensino Fundamental is split into two parts, the first one being 1st to 5th grade, and the second one being 6th to 9th grade. And they teach, all the fundamental stuff. I believe starting in 6th grade, they start teaching English and Spanish as well as Portuguese. In addition to all the typical things, math, social studies, sciences, stuff like that. Ensino Medio is what we would consider high school, right? Starts a little bit later, from 10th to 12th, and includes optional professional development courses. So yeah, those are the education systems. Let's go ahead and get into the problem of practice. I chose to talk about class size. The way I looked at this is when I went to the OECD and I looked at the students per teaching staff, which is a little bit different from class size, we'll talk about a little bit later on, but I think it's a good indicator of the kind of classes that you see, right? In the USA, we have a pretty average size, right? The OECD average is something like 14.8. USA, it's 15.0. In Ireland, it's a little bit lower, 14.9. And in Brazil, it's actually one of the highest students per teaching staff ratios in the OECD at 23.6. So as I noted, right, Ireland tends to have the lowest class sizes, whereas the United States and Brazil tend to have slightly larger than average class sizes. Although, looking at the data, right, USA and Ireland are pretty similar. However, when you look at the results of assessments, it turns out that Ireland's doing a little bit better. So let's get into why, right? And especially, why are Brazil's classes so big, right? This was an interesting question to sort of bump into, and one that I really wanted to have answered. And so after doing some research, I realized that the answer is really teacher's salary. As it turns out, only 43% of lower secondary teachers in Brazil had full-time contracts. That's as of 2018. 20% of teachers worked in multiple schools. And while the nation of Brazil has its floor of, what's it called? Its salary floor, only 45% of municipalities in the nation were complying with that national salary floor. Ireland, alternatively, right, with the lowest class sizes, barely, out of the three, has one of the highest teacher salaries in the nation, and the 7th highest starting salary in the EU. It's according to an article from, I believe, the Irish Monitor or something like that. The US has been increasing salaries recently. However, an article from the National Education Association shows that it's simply not at the same rate as inflation, right? So yes, um, salary is increasing, but not at the same rate as would be livable, which sort of explains this it's sort of middling class size, right? Yes, there are increasing salaries, but it's not quite as small because we can't hire as many teachers, right? It just goes like it's almost common sense. Um, More teachers means smaller class sizes, right? Uh, if you have less teachers, it's probably because you have a lower salary. If you have a higher salary, you have more teachers. If you have more teachers, you have smaller class sizes, right? So teacher salary really is linked to class size in a very meaningful way. That's one of the big takeaways as I'll discuss a little bit later. Here, but it's also important to understand the context, right? Because class size, right? This is a snapshot of the class size, but if we look at the context, how class sizes have evolved over time, um, it has changed. It has gotten better pretty much across the board for all three of these nations, right? They've decreased from 2005 in Brazil, right? It used to be much higher. They didn't give me the figure, couldn't find it anywhere, but it decreased to 23, right, in primary classes, which is good. And satisfaction or like choosing to be a teacher again is pretty high in Brazil as well, which is good to see. You know, that's good context to have, right? We can only see if we only look at the bad things, right, we'll have a very deficit-based view of an education system. So it's important to know the positives as well. In the US, class sizes have also been decreasing, right? It was 19.6 on the average in 2017. Now it's 18.3 in 2021. That's overall, right? We were just looking at primary. Sorry, this information was based on primary classes, right? Primary ratio, as you can see right here. And then in Ireland's classes sizes are probably remaining small because school funding has increased since 2020, right? By 1.8 billion euro. That's nearly 20% increase. That's not a small increase, right? Um, we'll talk about this more, but really, the reason I call this squeaky wheel and why I talk about this is because this whole thing has really made me realize that if you want to make effective change, you need the money. We'll talk about that more as we continue, right? Um, Speaking of that, right, the solution is largely a political one. I read an article from these two academics in Brazil who want to start a movement to start an educational party that would have a role in legislature that could affect change in the government, create policies, create educational standards and curricula that would benefit the students and the teachers and the educators and the academics of Brazil, right? Um, and Ireland's success with smaller class sizes is a result of their high funding and political support for education, right? It's literally like everywhere I read, they were like, we want equitable, well-funded, high quality education for students who we have high expectations for all of them, right? In the US, something similar could be done, right? As is being proposed in Brazil, instead of um, an educational party, right? There's not really parties in our government the same way there is in Brazil. We would have just this coalition, this union of teachers, administrators, academics, researchers, advocating for increased funding and payment for educators across all levels, right? I'm talking about substitute teachers, part-time teachers, resource teachers, special education teachers, academic, or graduate students who are teaching in universities but getting underpaid. All of these should come together to sort of like advocate for educational policy that benefits all of us, right? That's really what I think the solution and kind of support that you would need is, as this is being talked about in Brazil and as we can see in Ireland. So getting into a little bit more equity, sort of broader view things, I want to talk about demographic diversity in these three nations, right? So the United States is super diverse, right? I think while the plurality is about 22.2 million white students in the United States, according to the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, excuse me. And like it's also like 14.4 million Hispanic students and like 7 million Black students and 4 million Asian students. It's a very diverse nation. However, looking at educators are overwhelmingly white and predominantly female, which is sort of disheartening to realize, right? In Brazil, the population is also quite diverse, and they actually, out of the three, have been doing the most to ensure diversity among teachers, right? They've been increasing the amount of indigenous teachers coming from indigenous communities to ensure that those indigenous communities are being educated, which is huge. However, it's been shown that non-white students, like Black and Indigenous, which make up the majority of the population, still face inequity in the classroom. I got that from the Borgen project and UNESCO. Uh, Ireland is predominantly white, with 94.1% of the population being white. However, in 2021, there was an article that claimed that 1 in 10 students were from a minority ethnic background in Ireland. However, only 1% of teachers in Ireland are non-white. Turns out that's actually because there's this really high barrier to entry to being a teacher in Ireland. Basically, in order to be a primary school teacher in Ireland, not only do you need to be able to speak Irish, Gaelic, right, which more than likely non-Irish educators will either have to learn or will not learn. And they actually have to have like an approval or like some sort of credential from the Catholic Church. So obviously like those kind of like almost like archaic, barriers to entry, teachers have to be able to be Irish and have to be Catholic, prevent a lot of minority ethnic teachers in Ireland from becoming teachers, right? People who are aspiring to become educators stop because there's these very odd barriers. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that these are social issues. And, I forget where I heard this, but it stuck with me so much is that, trying to solve a social issue with individual action is a very sad undertaking. So social issues require social solutions, right? Political solutions. Um, so here's our takeaways, right? That's one of the big ones. First, right, class size is linked primarily to teacher salary. So if you want smaller class sizes, hire more teachers. If you want to hire more teachers, increase teacher salaries. Um, Second, make sure that that there's low barriers to entry, right? Obviously, we don't want just anyone to become a teacher. We want to make sure we're hiring responsible, you know, teachers who will make safe decisions for our students. I'm not saying there should be no barriers. I'm saying that there shouldn't be anything unnecessary like in Ireland where you need to learn Gaelic and be Catholic if you want to educate, which, if you're a migrant from outside of Ireland who is Muslim or Buddhist, you're going to have a very hard time passing those barriers, right? You're not going to just change religions just for a job, or you might, but more than likely you won't, right? And finally, the success of public education is directly linked to how well-funded the education system is. I go into this more in the paper, but really my takeaway is that we need sort of like constant political advocacy for the increased funding of education systems and the increased salaries of teachers constantly, in our classrooms, in our teachers' lounges, at the town meetings, in front of our state legislatures. We need to be the squeaky wheel. And that's why I decided to call this presentation the squeaky wheel, is because in order for us to affect change, in order to make our classes more equitable and culturally responsive, right? In order to adequately address the diversity that exists in our classrooms in America and around the world, we need to advocate for these things. We need to be the squeaky wheel. And that's really the takeaway that I have from all this, from the whole class, really, right? If we want to affect change, it's not just going to happen if we don't do anything, right? And yes, we can make changes in our classroom, and yes, maybe we can affect change in our school and our districts, but that's not going to do much to change these, OECD level overview statistics and trends. If we want to change those things, we need to be the squeaky wheel and be constant political advocates for equity, cultural responsiveness, and diversity on all levels. So, yeah, that's that. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate everything you've done for us. I hope my visual presentation met the mark, and I hope you enjoyed reading and watching all this. I appreciate your time so much, and I will hope to hear back from you soon, I suppose. All right, this has been my vlog. Peace.